Hello, my dear Alpes friends. Right to culture through time. The living constitutions are characterized by openness over time, since their material content is given substance and recreated daily and repeatedly at each historic moment, inasmuch as they are the circumstantial outcome of a continuous and ineradicable love-hate or conflict-compromise relationship between values, principles, legal rules, and constitutional reality in a state of permanent evolution. Thus, the Constitution is not just the result of given historical circumstances, but also the way in which to react to them, and consequently, it is responsible, or not, in the case of failed constitutions, for building its own history. In this constitutional play of permanent interactions, there is an intercrossing between public history and private histories, since in a democratic state, under the rule of law, the Constitution is being daily built and invigorated by all and every citizen who, like Molière bourgeois gentilhomme, spend their entire life making constitutional law without knowing anything about it. This relationship between history and the histories of the Constitution is particularly evident in the domain of human rights or fundamental rights, where both situations of confrontation meeting of individuals and the community and problems of conflict cooperation between values, norms, and facts emerge in a vital manner. One should, therefore, view fundamental rights as the way to make effective the principle of the dignity of the human person in history, simultaneously under the axiological and historical perspective. The reason, therefore, is that the historical dimension of human rights represents a way to realize their axiological dimension, since the legal ethical principles attached to the dignity of the human person take on a concrete historical form in a certain community at a certain time. Hence, the perennity of human rights considered as prerequisites for the full realization of the dignity of the human person does not hinder the circumstantiality of their realization in a certain place at a certain time. A possible key to the interpretation of this combined axiological and historical dimension may lie in finding a link between the histories of the subjective competitive advantage of private citizens and those of the state and the Constitution, by having recourse to the idea of generations of fundamental rights. In this context, the generations of fundamental rights would be the expression of the historicity of the dignity of the human person at each stage of the evolution of the state and the Constitution, namely through the correspondence between first-generation rights and the models of a liberal state and Constitution, second-generation rights and those of a social state and Constitution, and third-generation rights and those of a post-social state and Constitution. However, in order to be able to speak of generations of fundamental rights, one must first clarify what it means by each of these terms, or each of those terms, so as to avoid any communication noise caused by the attribution of different, and in some cases opposed, meanings to an apparently common denomination. Thus, in my opinion, To speak of generations of human rights may be an ambiguous notion, should it be used in the determinist sense of an evolution from inferior stage to higher, more developed ones, each higher stage replacing the lower. In other words, and speaking metaphorically, should it be viewed as a phenomenon of generational conflict. And it can also be an erroneous notion if it is understood in an objectivist sense, meaning that the new generations no longer address the rights of individual persons, but rather with collective or communitary aspirations or aspirations of the people. In fact, the genealogical trees of fundamental rights also differ from one another. There are those authors who establish a difference between liberty rights, welfare or equality rights, and solidarity rights. The later rights, which embrace the right to development and the right to share in the common heritage of mankind, imply the duty of all states to collaborate and not merely that of each state to act actively, and they carry a collective dimension that justifies giving them a different name, rights to the peoples, as for instance Canutido proposes. Similarly, other authors acknowledge 4 generations of fundamental rights, considering that the first would be the generation of liberty rights, the second that of the democratic rights of political participation, the third that of social rights and rights for the workers, the fourth would be that of the rights of peoples. As for me, personally, I don't identify with these families of fundamental rights, and neither do I consider the elaboration of the corresponding genealogical trees correct. In my opinion, fundamental rights, just as any other subjective right, are advantageous legal positions of certain concrete persons, regardless of whether they are viewed individually or as a part of a group. They are not objective realities without a subject, belonging to everybody and to nobody, like Katrina's doves, like in the popular children's song, who fly from hand to hand and belong to whoever catch them. Objective rights should not be confused with subjective rights, since, as Henke writes, the right that exists separately from my person is obviously something different from my own right that I have in regard to another person. Thus, solidarity, development, the protection of the common heritage of mankind, among others, are fundamental objective principles of the international legal order. But, nevertheless, they are not human rights. They have their place in objective law, but not confer subjective rights to individuals. Nevertheless, now that these family matters have been clarified, I still believe it is worthwhile to use the term generations regarding human rights for the simple reason that generations of human rights are a useful notion if they are viewed as historical moments in the concretization of the rights of individuals. In, in this sense, the generations would represent one dimension of human rights, their historicity, showing how the common matrix of these subjective positions materializes over time, leading to a progressive enhancement and development of the forms of realization of the dignity of the human person. Likewise, the successive generations of rights, when understood as such, do not call into question the historical legacy of the previous ones, nor do they aim at replacing them, and they do not lose their individual dimension. One can say that they are successive stages of enhancement and development of human rights. Using the same metaphor as before, the issue here is not one of conflict or confrontation, but rather the coexistence of generations of human rights. Consequently, in accordance with this genealogical tree that I propose, and that connects generations of rights to models of states and constitution, the following should be kept in mind. That first, that under the model of the liberal state and within the framework of a non-interventionist philosophy of the state in the life of society, we have the first generation of human rights. It has emerged from that period, encompassing individual freedoms and civil and political rights. For instance, freedom of expression, religious freedom, the right to private ownership, the right to vote. What, what was at stake at the time, in the 19th century, was the protections of individuals against the state, which required that public authorities abstain from intervening in the sphere. Ironically, this could be even be referred to as the domains of individuals protected by the fundamental rights. Second, that the welfare state that assumed the dimension of benefits provider, taking upon itself tasks in the economic, social, and cultural fields, brought the second generation of human rights, corresponding to social rights. For instance, the right to work, to social security, to health, to education. Now, the new purpose was to ensure the protection of individuals through the action of the state, especially through the administrative function of the state. Answer, the name of administrative state given to this model, after the designation coined by German legal scholarship of Verwaltungsstaat, state of administration. However, at the same time, this new generation of rights is accompanied by a transformation of the political rights that had emerged in the preceding generation. They are extended to every citizen as a result of the enshrinement of universal suffrage, thus leading to the enlargement of the political public, typical of the technical and mass society, as Rogério Soares points out. Third, that the post-welfare state in which we live, within an infrastructural and constitutive logic aimed at the development of conditions for cooperation between public and private bodies, is linked with a third generation of human rights in new fields of the life of the society, such as the environment and the quality of life, individual protection in respect to informatics and the new technologies and AI, the artificial intelligence, the protection of life and personality rights in connection with genetics, and on and on. This class of rights also comprises procedural guarantees, the latter being understood not only as a means of legitimation of power, but also as a way of realizing subjective legal protection. Thus, this generation includes, furthermore, the right to a healthy environment, to quality of life, to access personal data, to conserve the genetic heritage, to participate and be heard in proceedings, to access to justice and to legal aid, to ensure full and effective protection of individual rights, among others. The point at issue is once more the re-emergence of the notion of protection of the individual against power, emphasizing the idea of the defense of individuals against new threats on the part of both public and private authorities, but without ever questioning the need for state action in order to protect those rights. The succession of generations gave rise to quantitative and qualitative changes to the concept of fundamental rights, which led not only to their enlargement, but also to their transformation. In fact, on one hand, new fundamental rights have been discovered, either in those new situations where the dignity of the human person is confronted by serious and diverse threats that were until then unknown or minor, requiring legal protection at the constitutional level, or as a consequence of the decomposition or recomposition of the classical fundamental rights, giving thus birth to new rights, or even as a result of the densification and transformation of rules, until then merely aimed at affording an objective protection or guarantee into rules of objective protection, into rules of subjective protection. The objective turned into subjective protection. On the other hand, a change in the original concept of fundamental rights itself has taken place because nowadays, when we already have 3 generations and have no idea of how many more will follow, those rights are no longer confined to the traditional freedoms, but currently include also rights to welfare benefits and rights of participation in procedures and proceedings. For that reason, although fundamental rights may still be considered rights of defense against illegal aggressions, that defense can no longer be understood in an entirely negative sense. It means merely as the abstention of the state from acting. It now implies that public entities must provide a large diversity of benefits and that participation and procedural guarantees have been enshrined in the law. It also means that said defense concerns as much private as public authorities. In a provisional summary, it is possible to assert that the change of generations requires the concept of fundamental rights to be both enlarged and brought up to date, and that such a legal reconstruction of the notion of fundamental rights tends to imply that the protection or defense they ensure is made effective simultaneously by their dimension of abstention, provision, and participation, and applies in relation to both public and private bodies are concerned. However, as proof that the historical and the axiological dimension are complementary, this effort to enlarge and reconstruct In a legal perspective, the theory of fundamental rights contributes to highlight the renewed unity of this category at two levels. First, that of the axiological identity of all fundamental rights, or better said, human and fundamental rights. In fact, whether they belong to the first, the second, or the third generation, fundamental rights constitute the adequate answer from the point of view of the Constitution to the problem posed by the duty to protect the dignity of the human person, which evolves in time and space according to the new attacks and challenges it has to face in social life. Second, that of the structural identity of all fundamental rights, since they may be all characterized in a legal perspective by the fact that they have at the same time a negative and a positive dimension, as well as a subjective and an objective facet. In what concerns the structural identity, the negative fact emerged with the first generation of fundamental rights conceived as freedoms or rights to refrain from being subject to attacks on the part of the state. However, this right of defense against public attacks in the constitutionally protected sphere continued to make sense and to be present in second and first generation rights. The truth is, there can occur attacks by the state that violate a fundamental right in the case of the right to property. For instance, an illegal declaration of public interest with regard to a property, or the right to work, for instance, discriminatory decisions based on sex in the context of access to or promotions in the civil service. Or the right to a healthy environment, it means for instance, an illegal environmental permit granted to an industrial plant producing or using toxic chemicals. Consequently, every fundamental right, regardless of its date of birth or generation to which it belongs, always shows a negative aspect that forces public entities or public powers to refrain from attacks likely to impinge on the subjective constitutionally protected vantage position. Symmetrically, despite the fact that the positive aspect of fundamental rights, which entails the obligation for the state to provide benefits or to cooperate with private bodies in order to make this effective, emerge in connection with the second and the third generation rights. Nowadays, it is equally needed for the protection of first generation rights. The reason, therefore, being that even classical or first generation rights do not depend on the mere abstention from acting on the part of the state, but also presuppose the cooperation of the state in their realization. First generation rights also require that the state create the necessary framework for making them effective through the action of the legislative, administrative, and judiciary. For instance, the right to vote cannot be implemented without electoral rules, voter registration, elections, counting of the votes, and the same can be said of the right to property, which depends no, not only on legal rules and regulations, but also on the acting of public authorities, the police, tribunals, administrative guarantees, and proceedings. It follows from this that, from the viewpoint of its legal structure, nowadays, every fundamental right, regardless of which generation it belongs to, always has a positive side, requiring the intervention and cooperation of public authorities so as to be made effective. The intensity of the need for the state to act in order to ensure that fundamental rights are realized is not the same in every instance. One should distinguish, as we shall later more clearly see, between cases where fundamental rights prescribe how the state must behave, the behavior being entirely or partially predetermined by the Constitution, on equivalent terms to those of the binding power or the zero discretion of administrative law, and correlated to the subjective dimension of those rights, fundamental rights as subjective rights, from those other cases where the need to adopt behaviors or take measures with a view to realizing the right depends on the willingness of the state and the margin of appreciation or discretion it possesses, in equivalent terms to those of the discretionary powers of administrative law, or the reserve of the possible, as constitutional scholars usually call it, a situation corresponding to the objective dimension of fundamental rights as objective structures of society. This is the reason why, from the point of view of their legal structure, all fundamental rights are identical, since they all present a negative dimension that presupposes a right of defense against public attacks, together with a positive dimension imposing on the state a duty to act to make them effective, which may correspond to either objective rights of individuals or to duties of an objective nature. It is, by the way, significant that each generation of fundamental rights has not only increased the catalogue of rights and freedoms, but has also contributed to the enrichment of their respective legal structure. In fact, the first generation emphasized the negative dimension of the rights, the second generations the positive dimension of their welfare character, and the third highlighted the positive dimension of their participative or collaborative character. However, regardless of the emphasis placed on either aspect of their content by each generation, the fact is that nowadays all fundamental rights exhibit simultaneously all those traits, albeit in different degrees, and possess the same complex structural identity, which is the result of the legal enrichment produced by historical evolution. The complex nature of the legal structure of fundamental rights is particularly evident in the history of the right to culture, which seems to suffer from anxieties with respect to its generational identification, insofar as its legal definition has changed over its successive stages of evolution. This is a fundamental right, the content of which appears to always be up to date with current fashions, since it keeps changing as it accompanies the succeeding generation of rights. In the first generation, it emerges as a freedom vis-à-vis the state, taking its place among the so-called freedoms of the mind, liberté d'esprit or liberté de la pensée, to use the terms aptly coined by Dominique Pereira. And it was explicit or implicitly enshrined in the liberal constitutions, since it could also be developed on the basis of the freedom of expression or thought, according to the prevailing notion of law. In the second generation, it takes the form of a right to welfare, falling into the category of economic, social, and multicultural rights. See, for instance, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or Articles 73 and 78 of the Portuguese Constitution. In the third generation, it takes on the dimension of a right to participate or shareholder right, Teilhaberrecht, as you say, our German friends, being an institutionalized form of cooperation between public and private authorities of a procedural nature. See the rights of participation in cultural public policies contained in Articles 73 and 78 of the Portuguese Constitution. Well, it was everything for the moment. So now please enjoy the wonderful statues of Nikit Sanfal in Hanover, where I've been last week teaching some law, and there I recommend as a cultural city. Bye, my friends. See you.